Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Fundamental Ownership Analysis. I am your host, Tiffany Iacolino, and I work on the marketing team at IIBA. IIBA is an independent, not-for-profit professional association serving the global business analysis community. A recognized thought leader dedicated to elevating the discipline of business analysis, we provide our global community with relevant tools, resources, and networking opportunities. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Questions tab in your control panel. We will answer some of your questions at the end of the session as time permits. You'll find a special offer in the Handouts tab. Today's webinar recording will be available for a limited time on IIBA's Webinar Archives page within 7 business days of the broadcast. I'm here with your speaker today, Howard Podeswa. Howard is a thought leader at the intersection of Agile and business analysis. For over 20 years, he's helped large organizations adapt and optimize their business analysis and planning practices for Agile software development approaches. He's authored books based on these experiences, UML for IT Business Analyst and the Business Analyst Handbook. He's just completed a new book for Agile BAs and product owners called The Agile Guide to Business Analysis and Planning, from strategic plan to continuous value delivery. At Noble Inc., he has provided Agile and business analysis services to clients worldwide, including the ISO, Moody's, the Mayo Clinic, TELUS, TD Bank, LabCorp, the FDA, and others. He's also an in-demand speaker at international BA and Agile events all over the world. In today's webinar, Howard will walk us through the core competencies of POA, key frameworks and practices in the Agile family, and much more. We'll start off today's webinar with a poll. I'll launch a question, and you can submit your responses using our voting tool in the control panel. The poll will be open for approximately 1 minute. So we'll go ahead and set that poll up for you. Apologies. I've skipped ahead. So here we go. Our poll is opened now, and we usually like to get a sense of where you are on your Agile journey. So our options here, A, are you in the early days, less than 6 months in an Agile organization? B, you're currently practicing within 6 months to 3 years, or your deep experience, more than 3 years. And we'll just give another moment for some of the answers to come in. And I feel like we have quite a few answers, so we can go ahead and close that poll, and we'll share those results out. And thank you everyone for submitting. And yeah, it looks like everyone, sorry, there was a delay on my end. It looks like we've got the majority sitting in our B area with 48% currently practicing. So that's good to know. We've got a great sense of our audience's comfort. So with that information, let's get started on today's webinar. I'm going to hand the presentation off to Howard to get us started. Hi, Howard.
Hi there, everybody hearing me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
That's great. First, I just want to thank the IIBA for inviting me. The timing is really great, and that the IIBA Guide to Product Ownership Analysis is out, and the certifications program is ready for it. So it's very exciting to sort of be presenting, a lot of the practices and just the discipline itself that's behind this. I have a very personal connection to all of this. and I guess it probably started, I mean, things go back to the 1990s really for me with business analysis and agile and product ownership. But I'd say in high gear, it's been since 2013. And I first sort of got interested in this question about product ownership analysis about 2013, and had a couple of large companies come and sort of present me this news that they were about to transform their entire organization over to Agile. And they were very confused about where analysis fit in, where the BA fit in, how, if there was going to be a BA, and if there was, how was it going to be shared with a product owner? And all of this confusion came about in these companies. One of them, by the way, just to give you some background, was a telecom company. The other one was Statoil. The reason for the confusion is that there was no mention of a business analyst role in Scrum, which was the primary methodology, the primary framework for doing Agile at the time, when most widely used. But it's also true actually for the others as well, like XP, other frameworks. And also because the Agile Manifesto itself seemed to really de-emphasize documentation and a lot of prior planning, which is the kind of work that BAs were often very much associated with in the past. And so it became just, I guess, a little bit ambiguous as to where they fit in, or even if they fit in at all. So it's when I guess first became presented with this, it came quickly clear to me that in fact the responsibilities of analysis and of planning were in fact shared responsibilities, and that no matter how we share them between the product owner, possibly a proxy product owner, and a BA and the rest of the team, it's one comprehensive process, getting all the way from the vision, which is where the product owner might begin the story, all the way down to detailed requirements and acceptance criteria, and ensuring that everything actually meets that. And that we needed some kind of comprehensive vision to tie all that together. And that comprehensive vision, in my mind, I called it Agile Analysis and Planning, hence the name of the book. The IABA has come up with a good name for it. I think it's Product Ownership Analysis. It's really the discipline behind product ownership. And it really is that all-encompassing thing, how to take either the vision for a new product or a major revision to a product and push it all the way through to delivery in a continuous manner. How do you do that with one comprehensive view? And that's really what product ownership in a sense is about. So today we're going to be focusing on what I call the part one of the story, which is to lay down the framework and the conceptual basis for product ownership analysis, what it is and how it fits into the organization, what its benefits are. And then I invite those of you who have time, and by the way, thanks for everybody during your very busy times these days for coming out to this one. We'll have a follow-up as well. We're going to dive into some of those practices, particularly the practices that have to do with doing product ownership analysis and agile processes at scale, which is a very difficult issue. And I think probably will fit in well also with where people are at. In other words, many of you have had at least some experience in agile development, and the next step from a first initial exposure to it is to beef it up beyond sort of the pure Scrum process or some of the initial fundamentals you began with, and look at how you scale this. Can we go to the next slide? Tiffany, moving. Okay, great, thank you. So we'll start off by looking at where the product ownership analysis discipline fits into the Agile organization as a whole. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, so here we have a slide on what is the product owner versus what is product ownership analysis. And really it's quite simply, one is a role and one is the competency. Is there a bit of a difference? Yes, because as I mentioned earlier, I think the competency isn't just something that product owners are involved with. It's, despite the name, it's actually a shared responsibility, but leadership is at the product ownership side. So here I have just a definition of what a product owner is, and you can find many different definitions depending on where you go. This one comes from the Agile extension to the BABOK. And we have this role as being described as represents the interests of all stakeholders in the product, that the product owner is responsible for defining the features of the product. What will the product actually be? What will it do? And to prioritize the backlog. When you get down to it, it's really very much about making sure that what you're building is the right thing and that it represents what stakeholders really need from the product. And then what is product ownership analysis then? The analysis part of it is the discipline behind it. Now, I'd keep everything the way that is on this slide, the way that you have it now. This is a quote from the Guide to Product Ownership Analysis from the IABA. I may just make, if I may, just a couple of small changes to it. I'd say that product ownership analysis supports product owners in their daily challenges, but I would say as well it supports product owners in the entire team, including the business analysts on the team, because it's a shared responsibility. And I'd also just clarify that when we talk about the wide range of analysis practices, we're not just talking about, analysis per se. We're talking about analysis and including the planning the implementation of those requirements over time in order to maximize value. Move to the next slide. So, we're going to spend some time talking about product ownership analysis. I want to really clarify what the whole point of it is. I mean, and that's actually worth clarifying, because if you look at the early Scrum guides, you will see in fact, let me just change that. You'll see, I believe I'm correct in saying, zero mention of analysis activities. Of the word analysis doesn't show up. I don't even remember if the word requirements showed up. I don't believe it did it in the original guides. So in that case, you can, be forgiven for thinking that product ownership analysis is the analysis part isn't even really it either doesn't exist or it's not a big deal. And this actually was a source of confusion at the beginning. But I see it as this: the value of doing the analysis, product ownership analysis, is number one, to provide a shared understanding of the product, the need for the product, and the requirements for the product, so that we can minimize waste. Now, what do I mean by minimizing waste? If there's a shared understanding amongst the whole team, and by this I mean the broad team, the product owner representing the customer and the customer wants, the testing, those who are responsible for testing, and those who are responsible for developing the actual product, if there is a shared understanding, there is less likelihood of errors due to miscommunication going along the way. And not only that, but we're also looking, most initiatives involve more than one team. And so we also want to make sure that there's a shared understanding across all of those teams. So it's very, let's say, the central duty of product ownership analysis is to make sure that that understanding is shared right across to avoid errors and waste due to making those mistakes. And if we look at all of the techniques of product ownership analysis that we're going to get into, many of those are about that specific, we can see from that particular lens. Now, those of you who have some business analysis background may be familiar with that idea. I mean, after all, that's also classic business analysis. The second part of this is what makes, I guess, POA as an agile practice different from how analysis alone looks like in a waterfall environment. And that is about maximizing the value that is delivered at all times. So what does that mean? It means it's the responsibility of POA and ultimately of the product owner to ensure that the investment is directed towards products and features of the highest value. You see, this is not a big issue in waterfall. Well, it is, I guess, to some degree, but the sequence in which we put things out in waterfall, I guess that's what I want to focus on, is not an issue because waterfall is a one-shot deal. You gather all the requirements up front for what you want for that chunk of development. Again, you understand it fully, so there are no mistakes, and then you produce it. And it doesn't really matter if I do this little piece first or that little piece first, because it's all going to be delivered at the very, very end of that development cycle. Now, that's not the way that it works in Agile, however. In Agile, the whole idea is iterative incremental development, so that we're developing the product or the changes to the product in a piecemeal fashion. And if that's the case, then we want to make sure that as we start delivering little pieces, that we are delivering the highest value pieces first, that we can get quick wins. And that if we make a mistake somewhere along the way and we're investing in the wrong things, we have some mechanism in place for finding it and for correcting course quickly. And so that's what I mean by maximizing the value that we deliver at all times. And so if we think of these two ideas, creating a shared understanding amongst everybody working on the product and maximizing the value that is delivered at all times, that's really what POA is all about. Can we move to the next slide? So on the slide here, number 9, I've sort of attempted to make a little bit of a breakdown between the product owner role within product ownership analysis and where does the business analyst / proxy product owner fit in. So a couple of things before we get into the details of these. Number 1, why did I say BA / proxy PO? The proxy product owner is a person who is a stand-in for the product owner on a team. Not all teams have such a person. Some teams just call them team POs, team level product owners. And the proxy PO is sometimes filled, or that role is filled by someone who is a business analyst, hence the slash. Now, what's the other thing I want to get across right away is that your mileage may vary. This slide is put together based on experience, my own experience, just looking at different teams and different organizations and seeing what actually happens in practice. There is no big theoretical breakdown that everybody follows, but for the most part, this is what you're likely to find. The product owner is focused on building the right thing. I think the top lines on each of these columns is actually probably the most important thing. So is what we are building the right product? So based upon the product owner's understanding of the market, the product and the positioning of the product within that market, is this the right thing to be building right now? Whereas on the other side, we have the business analyst or proxy PO, who is, if we wanted to summarize it roughly, it's, are we building it the right way? Now, what does the right way mean? Well, because we're doing things in an iterative incremental manner, we should be delivering value continuously. So for those of you who understand the language of stories, we should be putting stories out and completing them on a frequent basis. So daily, we should be seeing stories coming out. We should be seeing integrations happening so that the product is actually available, at least for testing, with new requirements implemented. And that should be happening on a very regular basis. Much more than, by the way, the once every 2 weeks that was initially thought of for Scrum. We're often seeing integrations happening a few times a day. So building it right so that value is delivered continuously, that's where we see the BA. Communicating that shared understanding, that part, of POA is where the BA is very heavily involved. If you think of the PO being mostly outward facing, understanding the market, and the BA being very focused, towards the team, then it's about the BA's role is very much about providing leadership with respect to the requirements. So what does requirements leadership really mean? It means actually, doing a lot of the facilitation of requirements workshops, a lot of the elicitation of the requirements. It means coaching others to do that work. It means managing the backlog, which is a fancy way of saying managing the requirements, making changes to them, updating them, sometimes actually the actual entering of items into the product backlog, the handling of non-functional requirements. All that is part of this BA responsibility. And then at a high level, we're talking here about possibly a center of excellence lead in business analysis, or lead BA. It's about preparing the requirements process itself. So in other words, what is the requirements process to use within this Agile context? It's tweaking the process, so figuring out which framework you're going to use or combination of frameworks. And then it's actually tweaking the framework itself. So for example, if you're going with the Kanban approach, part of that is determining what the work in progress limits are for work items at different stages. If you're working with the Scrum framework, part of setting things up is determining what your iteration lengths are going to be, and how long are these sprints going to be, what are the team capacities, and so on. So all of that preparation, yeah, that's all about the requirements analysis process, and it's typically part of where the analyst or proxy PO comes in. Closely working with the teams to get things out, and then a lot of other items that you'll see here are standard business analysis stuff, like working out business rules, stakeholder analysis, user analysis, and so on. What makes it more agile is that it's done in an incremental way, and that we have this other aspect of translating high-level features and splitting them up into smaller pieces of work, and where we have much more detail. So it's detailed stories, detailed acceptance criteria. If you've looked at this, the Scrum guide, you'll hear a lot about, you'll start to see now, finally, more about refinement of the product backlog items. That's a fancy word for saying prior preparation of stories and features so that they are ready to go when the development team, when it sits, it arrives at the development team and implementation actually starts. And then another thing that's very, very different in Agile is that if you are a business analyst working on a project like this, you'll be very much involved in ongoing negotiations about those stories. So in other words, you put maybe a pointer or a note about a requirement early on in the game, added that to the product backlog. But now, as it's coming up, there are a lot of negotiations that happen, because we may decide that we don't have enough bandwidth to implement an entire feature, but we might be able to do a few pieces of that feature. What are the most important parts of it? That's a negotiation between the product owner, who knows the value, and the development side, who actually knows how long things take. We may find that a particular feature, the way that it's being conceived, is going to take too much time, and this may happen even in the sprint itself, and we start to realize that, and we may begin to negotiate. All right, well, is there another way to get the main value out, but do it with a different technical solution? And so this challenging of the team to come up with a solution that fits the customer's needs, but may take a little bit less time, that's also part of the BA job, part of the proxy PO job in a typical Agile organization. And then, whereas the product owner is going to be looking at long-term goals and long-term strategy, if you look over on the left, you see the go-to-market strategy, long-term planning, and so on. At the BA side, it's about filtering that down into the shorter term, so providing a lot of support on iteration planning. What's the difference? At the high level, we're looking at which sort of big features are going to go into let's say, the next release cycle or the next quarter of development. At the smaller scale and the shorter term scale, we're looking at what we might be able to accomplish in the next couple of weeks or so. So if we talk about all of those things together, what I've just mentioned, all of that together is product ownership analysis, but typical split would be something like what we see on this slide. Can we move to the next slide? So I'm just curious now, and this is not a poll, but is there a way, by the way, for our attendees just to type in some answers like a yes or a no? If there is, I'm going to ask a question. How many of you are product managers today? You have that particular title.
How about I add that poll for our audience right now? Just give me a minute and I'll add that, and then we'll come back to it.
Oh, okay, great. All right. Yeah, sure.
Perfect.
Sure.
So
we'll
are you a product owner is the question?
Are you a product manager?
Are you a product manager? I'll add that. Thank you.
Either yes or no. Now, why do I bring this up? I'd rather not talk about this topic at all, but when I go into organizations, there's a lot of confusion about it. So I think we have to clear it up. When you walk into a company that's doing quote unquote agile, you may see people called product owners, and you may see people called product managers. So the reason I ask this question is I'm just curious how it is for all of you out there. Just to clarify, the product ownership role is something that's specific to Scrum. In other words, that term product owner came from Scrum. So if you're not doing Scrum, there's a good chance that you may not be anybody called a product owner. By the way, I see the poll is coming up now. So as you vote, we'll just continue on that. So that is product ownership. And we saw the explanation of what product ownership is. Some of you are called product managers, so we're going to find out in a moment when this poll comes through. And the product manager is a title that came about totally independently of Scrum. So if you're not using Scrum, you just might be called a product manager. And so we find actually every combination that you can imagine when I go into an organization. Those who are beholden to Scrum might call people product managers rather than POs. Those who are entirely in there with Scrum might not have product managers, only have POs. And there are also organizations that have both. And when they do that, often what I find is that the product manager is the one focused on outward facing activities. So understanding the market, liaising with channels and so on. Whereas the product owner is more team facing. And I see here, by the way, that most of you saw that we have about 11% actually are with that title of product manager, and some of you without that title. Just as an aside, which I think helps put some context on all of this, when Scrum was originally invented, the idea was, the intention was that the person who filled the role of PO would be the product manager. So in fact, there wasn't meant to be really a big difference between the two, or any at all. You may wonder then, well, why didn't they just call this person a product manager instead of a PO? And none of us would have to be dealing with this question. And the answer is that there was a concern that if the original term was used, product manager, that those who already were product managers would continue on with the waterfall practices that many of them were already using. And so to make sure that didn't happen, they came up with this new term called product owner, just so it was very clear that it wouldn't be done exactly the same way. Next slide. So this is a slide that I put together based on what I've actually found going on at the teams. Now, this is not based on a theory book somewhere. It's just actually based on what you actually see in practice, regardless of what the theory says. And so just quickly give you an idea of where this all fits in. Typically, let's start with the core team, what I call the Scrum team. So whether you're using Scrum or not, this is sort of the basic team, the tight team. And here you'll find all sorts of competencies being represented. What's in blue on the screen is a competency, or let's say a role within the team that has a lot of POA overlap. There's a lot of product ownership analysis going on in there. And a light blue, there's some overlap, and then very little overlap if it's white. So let's just focus on a couple of those things. Within the team, you typically find either a PO, a product owner, or a proxy product owner. Of course, big overlap there because product ownership analysis is all about that. Within the team, you might find a team analyst, somebody devoted to the team who is going to focus in on the analysis side of it, following the kind of split that we saw earlier, maybe being the lead on the elicitation, possibly on the requirements process, and coaching others to do so. And then, there's some crossover with UX, QA, data analysts, and so on, particularly QA, because as we'll see in a moment, actually maybe not so much today, but a little bit more when we dive into some of the other practices in the follow-up, that the actual specification of test scenarios is actually shared, and the analyst takes a big part in that. In fact, we don't see a big difference between testing and requirements analysis in an Agile environment when you're using practices like ATDD, acceptance test-driven development. So more on that later. And then I've also put in here that it's also often that we find that the analysts may not have enough work to do for a single team. Instead, we may have analysts who are shared amongst a group of teams. So in that case, we might consider the analyst to be on the extended team, and their services are being provided to the core team as necessary. So that's sort of an overall picture. Aside from that basic team structure, there is a product owner council, which is an organization that tries to resolve prioritization discrepancies between teams and other things like that. So we'll find them in other roles as well, but those are the main ones. Can we move on to the next slide? Moving forward to the next slide. Oops. All right, so here we are, slide 13, foundational practices. All right, so what I have on here is we could spend days talking about this slide, but which we don't have. But I want to give you just an overview of, if you have time to start looking into some of these and you're not familiar with all of them, where should you beef up, and what do we get out of this, and how do these different frameworks contribute to this thing called product ownership analysis? Well, everything begins with the Agile Manifesto. As most of you have at least some or a lot of Agile experience, I'm just going to briefly summarize it as follows. I'm going to show you a screen on that. But the basic principles and values that are behind the Agile way of working are in that manifesto, and they're still valid today. I'll just briefly, mention them to you. It's individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So it's much more, the value says it's much more important to get the right people and get them interacting than to get the right process in place. We have a value of working software is more important than comprehensive documentation. This is the principle that put chills down the spines of business analysts when they first saw it. Let's just say that this is not saying there is no documentation. It's saying that there is documentation, but it's less important than getting the actual software out. Secondly, the documentation that you produce in Agile is probably going to be less than you would have done otherwise, unless there are other reasons for doing so, which we can get into. Like compliance reasons, for example. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. You'll see that time and time again. There's techniques like the Triad, which I'll talk a little bit about later today. Basically, that says that whenever features are being discussed, we want various perspectives represented. Then we have the DevOps, BDD, ATDD, CI/CD. I was going to call them sort of technical practices that help make all of this hum and work properly. But of course, there's a little bit more than technical practices in there. Some of it's culture as well. But all of these practices are basically about how do we take an Agile approach and scale it so that the improvements that we put out there are going to happen on a frequent basis and a reliable basis. In other words, relatively error-free. It takes a lot of work to make that happen, and if you follow these principles of DevOps, BDD, and so on, you get them. Just to give you the acronyms, BDD stands for Behavior-Driven Development. ATDD stands for Acceptance Test-Driven Development, and together this is a set of practices that's all about defining the acceptance criteria for features and stories before implementation begins. And then CI/CD is all about practices for integrating those changes on a regular, continual basis and doing it safely. Then we have the actual Agile frameworks itself. I mean, the Agile Manifesto is just some general principles for doing things, but doesn't really give us much of a blueprint for how to go about doing it. So Scrum, Kanban, XP, the first ones you see there, those are the most popular frameworks for sort of to get you started, to get going on Agile. The most popular of these today, actually this would be an interesting poll, I don't know if we have time to do it, but is, who's using Scrum as the main one, who's using Kanban, who's using XP. I can say roughly in my own experience, most people are using Scrum as their main framework, but everybody pretty well I know is doing some sort of a mix. In other words, they might be using Scrum, but also using Kanban boards on top of it, and also using stories that come from XP. XP stands for Extreme Programming. It's also true, though, that there's a growing, at least from what I see, there is a growing trend to make Kanban your main process and put Scrum sort of techniques on top of the Kanban. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And the last three that you see there, or the last four, Safe, Disciplined Agile, Less, and Nexus, are all about scaling the approach. Now, Lean and Lean Startup Development, this is a whole framework of ideas that are all about minimizing the amount of waste in the process. And a big principle behind this is real options and a related concept of last responsible moment. And basically the idea about that is, I would call it responsible procrastination. Leaving activities, even though they're necessary, but pushing them as late as possible, doing them as late as possible at the last responsible moment. That's what LRM, as we sometimes refer to that. Those concepts all come out of lean and lean startup development. Some of you may be familiar also, lean software development. Some of you may also be familiar with lean startup, which is something a little bit different. And this is the idea, if you've heard about the idea of experimenting with ideas for innovations right in the marketplace with actual customers, that all comes from this idea of minimum viable product, lean startup, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then theories of disruptive innovation come out of authors like Clayton Christensen, who have looked at low market innovation disruptions and new market disruptions, and come up with theories and strategies for being successful at doing that. All of this together feeds into this POA discipline. Next slide, please. So central across all of these, if I had to pick like the most important principle of Agile, and then that sort of underlies POA, it's iterative experimentation. It's very much about trying something instead of doing a lot of planning. It's the approach is instead, you know what, rather than do that and try to figure out theoretically, what would be important and what we should be doing. Let's do it another way. Let's take a separate approach. Let's actually just try a brief experiment, a proof of concept, and then let's see if it works. Let's put in mechanisms in place that if there is a problem, we're going to fail fast, right? We're going to find that problem quickly. We're going to learn from it, and then we're going to repeat the process over and over again. And this is an approach that is put there on purpose across the enterprise. So this is, many of you are familiar with this as an idea that we ought to use for software development of products. Yes, that is true, but it's not everything. Excuse me. This approach is also important for all other aspects of the business. So for example, if you're exploring new marketing channels, if you're thinking that your product, if you have the thought that, this product would really be great if we market it to an entirely different market, possibly with some tweaks. You're changing your market strategy. All aspects of the enterprise, instead of the Agile approach is, instead of spending a overly long period trying to work out theoretically if it's a good idea, it's no. You have an idea that this product might work in another market. Well, then why don't you do a proof of concept to show it? I actually had a question like that not too long ago from someone where their organization was working on Venturi tubes for typically used for barbecues. And then there was this hypothesis that those same tubes or that same technology would be very, very useful in an entirely different market for HVAC. Because when you look at the main point of those tubes, it's basically to get gas safely from a source to the place that's going to actually use it. Well, rather than do this approach of iterative experimentation, let's say instead of try to figure out theoretically, doing vast market research on this to see if it's a good idea, why don't you actually do a little experiment? Take the product within your product line that seems to be the most let's say the best fit, choose the target market that would be the best fit to target this product at, and actually see if you're actually able to do it. If you can grow the market for that test case, and that's the best test case, that's a good sign. But if you can't for that, then it's not a good sign. And what do I mean by failing fast? It's a central concept. What it means is it's okay to fail as long as you fail quickly and as long as you learn from that. And how do you know that you failed quickly? Because we have a lot of mechanisms in place, metrics, and particularly key risk indicators that are there as early warning systems to determine if your experiment is going in the wrong direction. Next slide. So if we look at the approaches to planning, they basically go down into, they break up into two rough approaches. Some are based on a flow-based approach, and others are based upon a time-boxed approach. So sort of how I see them. Amongst the flow-based, there aren't many that are popular. Kanban is the primary one. And basically what it means is you commit to an item by item by item before you start implementing it. And what that also means is that you're able to reprioritize that item until the very last minute, until you've actually started implementing the item. I think you can see from that that one of the pluses of this approach is that it's extremely adaptive because of that ability to reprioritize to the last minute. It also accelerates learning. If we were doing little experiments, then we would like to, let's say we try to feature out, or we learn that we should actually be spending more time on that feature, developing it further. Well, if we had already blocked out the entire, let's say an entire 2-month or 3-month period, it's very hard to put these new features that we're finding out about as being really valuable. It's hard to put them into the plan. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to do it. With flow-based planning and Kanban, there's no problem at all, because any feature that you haven't started working on yet can still be reprioritized. So where does this really work out well? This approach works out really well as your primary approach if you're doing small customer-driven work items. So if you're a team that's doing that kind of work, this is a really, really good approach to look at as your primary framework, not as something added on to Scrum, but actually as the way to work. And if you're doing innovative product development, where there's extreme uncertainty about features, you need the maximum ability to change course, and Kanban gives that to you. Now, if that's the case, why isn't everybody using all Kanban all the time? Because they're not. It has a big downside. If every team is working according to its own schedule and making these decisions about items that's going to work on, a piece at a time, there is no time. Everybody will tend to be out of sync, and there will be no time, or very rarely will there be a time, where all of the teams that you need for a large initiative are available at the same time. And so that is why the next approach is extremely popular. So if we can look at the next slide. So for cases like that, when you have teams who are primarily working on larger projects, we recommend, they often end up using Timebox Planning. What does it mean? We plan for a time box. A time box means a chunk of time, right? A planning horizon. The frameworks that use that include Scrum, Extreme Programming, and SAFe. When I say planning for a time box, it often happens at different planning periods. So a large planning period would be a quarter. So planning for the next 3 months or so. I'm using quarter kind of loosely. If you're using the SAFe framework, they refer to this as a program increment, roughly about that period of about 3 months or so. Excuse me. And then at a smaller time frame of planning, we're looking at the iteration, or a sprint, which is roughly about 2 weeks. And so the idea is we commit upfront to the items for that time box. I should say that the commitment is not a 100% firm commitment. It's more that we're committing to a goal, and that at the beginning of the time period, it looks like this is what we're going to be able to accomplish. There is, place for change once that begins. After all, this is an agile process, but it's more difficult to do. It's more difficult to make those changes. The plus side is, though, that it does mean that at the beginning of every quarter or every PI, all the teams within a group are aligned. And it also means that at the beginning of a sprint, everybody meets to do their short-term planning as well. So generally, I can't give a across-the-board guideline because every case is different, but generally for most organizations, it's good for their teams to reserve time as a little bit of a mix. Some of their time is reserved for time box planning, so that they can work, that's primarily for long-term initiatives that they want to be working on. And then some of their time is reserved for short-term planning, governed by frameworks like Scrum. Next slide, please. So now let's have a look at some of the tools and techniques of POA. Next slide.
I jumped ahead on you.
Great. So here we have, boy, we got a lot here, and again, long time we could spend on these, but I just want to give you a brief overview of what we're looking at here. I've organized these so that roughly on the left it roughly matches what we saw about the PO, the product owner, versus the proxy PO/BA over on the right-hand side. In other words, the left-hand side are high-level tools that have a lot to do with visioning and getting things started up for product development. The right-hand side gets into some of the more detailed analysis. And again, just roughly. So what do we have on the left-hand side? Root cause analysis and visioning to make sure that we understand what the product is all about and what we're trying to accomplish. Hypothesis testing to determine what are the unknown assumptions about this product, assumptions that are so important that if we get them wrong, we have to totally change direction. So determining those hypotheses and testing them out is what I mean by MVP hypothesis testing. Discovery-driven planning takes the Agile approach and applies it to finance. And then we have sort of high-level strategy that has to do with full potential plan, product roadmap. They all have to do with what are we going to be doing over the next period, the next long period. And if you look over on the right-hand side, it's more of the detailed analysis. Story mapping is about planning the stories over the next iteration. If you remember that we talked earlier about the fact that a proxy product owner or a business analyst is heavily involved in planning for the next iteration. By the way, I use the word iteration and sprint interchangeably. Sprint is a Scrum word, iteration is more generic. A lot of the classic modeling things that you've done before apply here as a BA if you've been a BA. And then things that are much more techniques that are more specific to Agile, like minimum marketable features, minimum marketable product, BDD, ATD, which I mentioned earlier, and so on. These are all techniques. Those techniques are all about getting value out in an incremental manner and a safe manner, but in a way but doing it in a fashion that the most important value comes out first. Next slide, please. What I've done here on this slide is try to give context. Like, I think you'll see that the previous list, it's a big list. If you're starting out on this, which technique do you use at one time? Extremely confusing. So I thought it'd be very important to put together a map that shows where these techniques fit into the overall development process. Again, we could spend a long time on this map. This is really the map of everything. But I just want to give you sort of the structure and how it's all laid out. Going from left to right are something I call activity zones. So can we go back to that? Our activity zones. So these represent, it's not a waterfall approach, but they represent periods of time where the focus is on one thing versus the other. So we go from initiation and planning, which is all about getting new product development started, to seeding the backlog, which is determining what are going to be the most interesting features to work on. After that is quarterly inception. So that all of that happens at the beginning of a whole new product or a big major change to a product over a long period of time. And then as we get to the beginning of every quarter, or every program increment, PI, if you're using the SAFe terminology, or every release cycle, which is roughly the same thing, we do the activities in quarterly inception. And so you'll see things like quarterly planning and the roadmap and so on featured in there. The items that are below either represent activities or artifacts that are produced at that time. And then iteration inception is about the beginning of every sprint or every roughly 2-week period or so where we use iteration planning. Then we've got the daily activities that are ongoing analysis and planning activities that happen day to day. Then there's certain things that happen at the end of every sprint, particularly the sprint demo that most of you are very familiar with, and things that happen at the end of a quarter just before we're about to go to general availability. And then if you look from top to bottom, I've divided up by lanes where techniques that are most important as your basic set of techniques for any project that's going to be up to 2 or 3 months of work, where teams can work on them individually. That's your core set of practices along the top. The next row below that, the next lane, is what I call the long lane, and that's for projects that are longer, from anywhere from a not just 1 quarter, but like 2 quarters up to as long as about 5 years, where we start adding more long-term planning capabilities and retrospective capabilities. And then finally, we get into the grand lane, which is, okay, well, now on top of all of that, it's not just going to be one team working for a long time. It's going to be many, many teams interacting together over a project. And so then we have to add in all sorts of other techniques for managing the work between those teams. And that's what that last row is all about. And if you're at any particular point in your project, you can see this as a grid and just say, okay, well, I'm a large project and I'm in iteration inception. What are the specific tools that are going to help me out for that? And that would be scaled iteration planning and iteration planning at the team level. Next slide.
Okay, and I just want to take a moment here just for a quick time check, just for those. Hopefully you can bear with us. We may run over a few moments just to kind of get through the rest of the content. No, it's too good. It's too good to cut it down. So we'll keep going. I just wanted to mention that. So if our attendees can bear with us a couple minutes more as we continue, and then hopefully get to some of your great Q&A. So go ahead.
And by the way, I think we'll make it probably just at the line for the 1 o'clock, and then the Q&A is where we may go over.
Perfect. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay.
So I just want to sort of give you a feeling about, I wanted to center, just to end off, talking a little bit about feature preparation, because when you get down to the day-to-day analysis activity, a lot of it has to do with this thing called feature preparation. So what does that mean? Finally, the Scrum Guide in 2020 put in some words to help really understand what this idea of analysis is all about. Now, you won't find that word there, but you'll find product backlog refinement, which is really all about that. So what is it? It's the act of breaking down and further defining product backlog items into smaller, more precise items. In other words, many of you know this term, it's splitting stories. It's taking items and chopping them up into smaller pieces, each of which will give us some value. And it's an ongoing activity. This is not something that we do up front. The way that we do it in a waterfall approach is something that happens throughout the process. And it's not just about splitting up those requirements, but it's about learning more about them, adding details. For example, what are the acceptance criteria for each item? How would you describe the item? What's the estimate on how long it would take to do it? What's the prioritization for the item? All of that's part of feature preparation. Next slide, please. So the reason that we're going to spend, there's such a big push initially with Agile to say, let's just not prepare, let's not plan too much, let's just go right and do the work. Well, it turns out that you have to do some planning and some preparation in order to get the following benefits. The first is to reduce communication. If we do some planning, we can then end some preparation of features and stories before people work on them. Then we know that everybody inside the team and across teams has the same understanding of what the requirements are, which means that we're less likely to have errors because, let's say, the tester or the developer didn't understand what the product owner meant. We're going to have less integration errors and less delays. Because since we understand the requirements better going in, we're also able to estimate them better going in, which means that our forecasts are going to be more accurate as well. Less integration errors, because part of the whole approach is to define in feature preparation what the end-to-end acceptance criteria, scenarios, and tests are going to look like. And since we specify that up front, right from the very beginning, everybody has that shared understanding of what to expect, and there's less chance that you're going to have an error along the way. And add to that the fact that we actually we do this integration testing continually instead of waiting until the last minute. And that also means that less chance that there's going to be an error discovered at the very end. Next slide, please. So we said that it's all a collaboration. Many of you have heard of the concept of the Triad, also goes by other names, as a fellow Dinwiddie who developed this idea. But it really comes initially from behavior-driven development. And in behavior-driven development, it wasn't a triad, it was a foursome. Because what's missing in the triad is the business analyst. But it's mentioned in BDD. So the business analyst is the person who or the role that's responsible for being the prime for elicitation and for challenging the team. What do I mean by that? It's making sure that the team is actually working on the right thing at the right time. The PO is involved in the discussion because they know which are the features that are most valuable and which aspects of each feature are most valuable. Development is there because they know what makes that feature so big, right? What is it about that feature that makes it really big? And the QA perspective is there because they know they can squeeze out the requirements and help squeeze them out by looking at edge cases, and also in the end by actually writing the tests based on this understanding. And by the way, I say perspective because it doesn't mean these are different people. Increasingly in Agile, developers actually do the QA side. So it's a collaboration, and whenever features are being discussed, all these perspectives need to be represented. Next slide, please. So the general guidelines are for when do you actually begin this preparation. If you're using a time box approach, in which case you're doing quarterly planning, then about halfway into the previous quarter is when you should begin looking at the upcoming features for the next quarter. So that gives you, roughly about a month and a half or so to get those things prepared enough so that you're ready to go when the release cycle or the next PI begins. And then when we're looking at iteration by iteration, in other words, sprint by sprint, then we're preparing things at the story level. Stories are smaller than features, and I'm going to get that in a second. And we start looking at these stories and preparing them one or two iterations before. That's just to inspect them, to see, basically just to highlight stories that need to be split, and stories that require extra preparation. The actual preparation typically begins about halfway into the previous sprint. In other words, the last week of a 2-week sprint. Next slide. I've just put this out here because of terminology. Again, this is not in theory, but this is in practice, again, based upon what I'm seeing generally going into organizations. We have to have some way of talking about stories because size is a big issue. If a requirements item can't be done within a 2-week period, it's not the right size for Agile development. So the trick is really to begin at something above the story level and work your way down. And so many organizations come up with something like this. At the highest level, they'd call it an epic. They're doing this is a very big change that might be a product-wide change. Here I have an example about introducing dropship capability for the business to increase top-line sales by 10% without the inventory expense. Dropshipping is about being able, where it allows a customer to order something without the company they're ordering it from keeping that item in inventory. That's what happens is the order goes directly to the supplier. So there's an epic, and there's the reason for the epic. This could be something that takes many groups of teams over a long period to do. A feature is a requirement that's broken out of that. It typically is something that can be accomplished by a tight group of teams. In SAFe, they call these an Agile release train, working in concert with each other, but shouldn't take more than a quarter or a program increment. In other words, roughly about 3 months to get the job done. And the feature is actually really the primary unit that is used for testing purposes, for documenting the tests. And actually, the feature files are more than just documents, they're active. Also for documentation purposes. It's roughly equivalent to a use case, for those of you used to the use case approach. And then each feature has to be broken down into stories. A story would be a little part of functionality within that feature that is small enough to be able to be accomplished by a single team within a program increment. Sorry, less than that, I'm sorry. A single team within a sprint. So within roughly about 2 weeks. Next slide, please. And by the way, this is rough because there are organizations and teams who would like their stories to be even smaller than what I just said. So the story is the one that most of us are familiar with. It's the Atomic Agile Requirements Unit during development. By the way, I think it's too small a unit to use for documentation purposes, which is why I talked for a few moments earlier about the feature. But during development is the ideal one. It's a work item that's small enough that can be done by a single team, as I mentioned earlier, within a short period of time. But here's the thing that not everybody knows. It's not just necessarily about delivering user value. Most people understand that a story must deliver value. That user value means it delivers functionality to the user. But there's all sorts of other values that are also important, and stories can deliver them as well, in place of just user value. So, for example, business value. Business value might be increased efficiencies. The user may not feel that, but the company may feel that because it's costing them less to get the job done. If you're adding a service fee, the user is not really loving that, but business may love that. So that's business value. Learning value can be, for example, running a technical spike. Those of you who've heard that. It's basically a little chunk of work to understand more about an upcoming story so that we can estimate it properly. I mean, it can be more than what I just said, but that's one of the ideas of learning value. And technical benefits, we might actually be doing some architectural improvements, for example, that are going to improve things later on, maybe increase the maintainability or the reliability of the system, but the user can't do something that they couldn't do before because of it. All of these things are of value, and if the story delivers it, it's a story. Next slide. Those of you who have been dealing with stories have probably seen the first template. And by the way, a story is a story as long as it obeys everything I just said earlier. It does not have to be written in a specific format. However, the most popular format out there is the one you're seeing at the top, as a, followed by the user role, I want to, followed by the functionality, the feature that I want, and then the so that is the rationale, why I want to do it. And some people like this other format. It's becoming more popular over time. Now it's called the job story, and it works a little bit differently. You see very similar items. When I respond to a customer service call, this actually is identifying the use case or the context for the requirement. I want to view the customer's next renewal date. Looks exactly like the user story we saw before, except it has an I instead of as a service representative. The thinking there is that there are often circumstances where the user is obvious, so there's no point to put them in, or many different types of users may access this functionality, and so there's no point in actually naming them. And so this whole format puts the I guess context further ahead so that it sort of leads the discussion. And you may find various other variations on these formats. The format's not important. It's the idea of what the story is, but the formats help you make sure that you address important issues about a story. Next slide. So with that, folks, we're kind of, that's the first part of this. I wanted to introduce to you some of the main concepts, give you a feeling for why we have such a competency, who performs that competency, and where the competency fits into the whole Agile organization. I hope that's given you some value, and we'll turn the floor onto some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Howard. That was such an informative overview. And thank you to the attendees for sticking with us. We're going to open up now for a Q&A to answer some of your questions. Some of them have been pouring in throughout the session. If you have any, go ahead and plug them in. I'm going to jump into the first one, and we won't be able to get through everything just because there was a lot of questions, but given the fact that we're going to have a number 2, we can maybe take an opportunity to get to some of those other ones in that
That's
session.
a great idea. Yeah.
So I have a question here from Rashma, and the question is, what's your definition of highest value?
All right, well, there's actually a formula for it. And I can bring that up or put it on, get that out for you. It has to do with the cost of delay. And basically, we look at various components of value, and each one, I mean, if you want to do this mathematically, each one can be given and is, according to methodology, is given a point value. So we're looking at user value as one of those components. and so we give it maybe a point system to define, how strong this user value is of this story based upon maybe a standard 1-point story. The same way as we estimate stories, we also evaluate them with points. We look at risk reduction. So we may be doing a story because the value is it will reduce risk in the future. So that's another piece. We look at timeliness. So that's how important is it that this story be done right now versus being done a little bit later? The value of the story may be dependent upon it being done urgently, very, very quickly. So there's a number of components like this, and all of these together give us the value. And then what we then do is we take the overall value of that story and then divide it by the effort to produce that story, and that gives us an overall sort of way to prioritize what that story is. When you finally end up with that number, the number, the story or the item that has the highest number would be the highest priority. Now, I'm saying it as a formula. It's more of a guideline about how to think about it. But that's the approach, and that approach, by the way, comes out of the SAFE methodology. So I have a lot of that in detail in the book about how to do those calculations, and I can maybe produce a slide for next time or a handout as well, just to give you that formula.
Thank you so much. Yes, maybe something we could work into part
Mm-hmm.
2.
Yeah.
I'll just take one more question, just given we're over time. This one
Sure.
is from Marcella, and the question is, how would you recommend to start in this industry without having experience?
Whew. I guess when you say not experience, it depends on, I mean, most people have some experience. So I'm not sure if you're not even we're talking about someone who's not a BA, not a POA or whatever, but if you are a business analyst, it's not uncommon actually for business analysts to be thrown onto just to be thrown cold onto a Agile team and just to be told, find a way to fit yourself and add value to that team. It sounds a little crazy, but I've actually seen that in many organizations because that's about as good as they can get right at the beginning. I'd say definitely do your reading. There's my own book on Agile analysis and planning, and what I do there is I actually walk you through an initiative to build a new product. It's based on actually an insurance product that one of my clients was working on. And actually follows through everything that you have to do until the very end. And if you actually work through, and there are case studies to work through, if you work through them, you'll get a lot of sort of at least theoretical hands-on experience on how to do it. So one is education and taking courses and so on. Volunteer. If you see if there is a team that's starting up and they're looking for an analyst in there, I just volunteer for it to get started. Of course, there's certification. The IABA has the Agile extension to the BABOK, which I think is an excellent source, as well as the Guide to Product Ownership Analysis, which you're seeing on your screens right now. So that will lay it out for you as well. So I say, yeah, it's just get your experience. Just start to get experience wherever you can.
Great answer. Great answer. I'm just going to jump ahead and just mention, as we did at the start of the webinar, your new book, and just a reminder that webinar attendees in the US can visit the publisher's site to get a special 35% savings on the book or the new ebook. So just download the flyer in the handout section, and that'll give you your exclusive discount code. And then again, for anybody internationally on Amazon.com. And that takes us to the end. Again, thank you for sticking with us a little over time. It's not usual, but when we have such a hot topic that we have to break into 2 sections, it's bound to happen. So thank
Thanks
you.
everybody for hanging in.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us today. Again, we will have a part 2 to this. Look out for more information from us for registration. It'll take place in June, so keep your eyes open for that. And then Howard just you wanted to make a quick mention of another webinar you are hosting and leading later this week on Friday. So for any registration details there, you can jump on to LinkedIn, Howard's LinkedIn or even at IIBA's social media. You can find information on how to register. And finally, a thank you to our attendees for being here today. We will send a follow-up email to you. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know. Thank you for joining us once again, and we will see you all next time. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.